the way I'm thinking about this panel is really to reflect on a couple of historic facts first, and then try to think about a constructive way forward. And the basic historic fact that I want us to focus on is that there was a NATO summit held in Bucharest in 2008, at which Georgia and Ukraine expected and hoped for, but were not offered, a so-called membership action plan towards full alliance membership. It has to be said that membership action plan was itself a bit of a sort of artifice created to facilitate the integration of the previous batch of countries, but the basic question is whether that failure to move forward with membership in a serious way is the original sin that has caused since then so much instability and suffering in this part of the world. To address this question, I'm thrilled to be joined by Ambassador Kurt Volker, who now wears many hats, but who served as the last Bush administration ambassador to the alliance, and who also served earlier as director for Europe and Eurasia on President Bush's National Security Council. I'm also thrilled by the presence of Senator Michał Kamiński from Poland, who now serves as the Deputy Speaker of Poland's Senate. He's a member of the Third Way, sort of centrist, conservative-ish party that's part of the current governing coalition. But earlier he served as the press secretary to late President Lech Kaczynski. So I see. So both Michał and Kurt had front row seats to the events of 2008. And last but not least, we are thrilled to have, after a tumultuous journey to Ukraine and many return flights to Frankfurt and so on and so forth, Katie Sendak, who is the director of Transatlantic Defense and Security at CEPA, and who has a long track record working both for the House and Senate Armed Services Committees. So, warm welcome to the three of you. And I want to start with you, Kurt, if I may, or Ambassador Volker. There is this zombie idea, which seems impossible to kill in some circles, namely the idea that there was a promise made by Americans never to expand NATO, and by expanding NATO, Americans supposedly provoked Russia to its adventures in Georgia and also to the current full-scale invasion of Ukraine. I mean, this notion has been exposed most recently by the notable foreign policy thinkers David Sachs and Elon Musk on Twitter, who say that if you just took NATO membership for Ukraine off the table, the war could be brought to an end. So what would you tell Mr. Sachs and Mr. Musk in response? And more broadly, why is it so difficult to kill this zombie idea?
Thank you. I hope, yes, there we go. Thank you, Dalibor. And it's hard to kill a zombie idea because Vladimir Putin keeps it alive. He keeps pushing it out and pushing it out and pushing it out, despite there being nothing to it. It's interesting that people keep saying that there was a promise made to Russia that NATO would not enlarge, when the person who supposedly made that promise, Secretary of State James Baker, has publicly, repeatedly come out and said, in spoken word and in writing, that it's not true. So even the person who they allegedly are saying did this didn't do it, and has said that. But nonetheless, they persist in this. The other part of that narrative is that, well, it's NATO enlargement that caused Putin to attack. The empirical evidence is the opposite, is that Putin has attacked countries that have not joined NATO, particularly Georgia and Ukraine, and occupies parts of Moldova, and has not attacked countries that are in NATO. And the idea that this is somehow new and threatening to Russia to have borders with NATO countries is also empirically false, because they have had a border with NATO in Norway, including all of that maritime Arctic space, since NATO was founded. The same with the Black Sea and Turkey, the same with the Bering Sea in the United States and Canada. So this is just simply made up stuff that Putin has used to confuse Western publics and justify his attacks, which is what he does there. Now, you started the conversation by referencing the Bucharest summit and that perhaps being the original sin. I would say it this way instead. The sin perhaps was taking for granted that Putin would act like a normal European leader and not someone who's just hell-bent on restoring the Russian Empire and subjugating other people. We got that wrong. We should have realized sooner, as John McCain did, what Putin was all about. But having got that wrong, the problem with the Bucharest summit and with many, many, many other things we have done, including very recently, is we are not thinking through the message that we are sending to Putin. The message that the Bucharest summit sent to Putin was that the alliance is not united, that it lacks resolve in terms of support for Georgia and Ukraine, and therefore it's a green light for Putin to do what he wants. That is exactly the message that came out of the Vilnius summit as well, that we lack resolve when it comes to inviting Ukraine to join NATO, and therefore he should keep fighting. He should keep the war going. We're about to go into a Washington summit, and so far it looks like we're going to send him the same message again.
To turn to you for a moment and perhaps ask you for your recollections of 2008. So your former boss, the late President Kaczynski, I think it's fair to say, was a very prescient figure in identifying the Russian threat and warning against it. And many of those warnings, as I remember, were falling on deaf ears in Paris and in Berlin. I mean, the Bush administration was perhaps more enthusiastic about enlargement, but it did not happen nonetheless. So could you maybe shed some light on what those conversations were like back in 2008 in Bucharest?
Thank you very much for invitation here. I'm really honored to be part of this discussion. I perfectly remember 2008 and our preparations for the NATO summit with the President Kaczynski. I served as his Secretary of State, and I also served at that time as the chairman of the Presidential Committee, Poland-Georgia and Poland-Ukraine. And it was my capacity and my task to organize also the famous visit of President Kaczynski together with President Yushchenko to Tbilisi in 2008, together with President Adamkus and Prime Minister of Latvia, when actually Tbilisi were almost under siege of Russian army. But before that, summit in Bucharest happened. After a couple of months, Russia invaded Georgia. My recollection is, I remember it was the first time when I had the opportunity to hear Mr. Putin in Russian in a very close, relatively close room, in which he delivered his famous, unpublished at that time, speech about the future of Ukraine. I was listening this speech live in Russian, which is my second language after Polish, so without translation. And I was shocked, not only by the substance, what he said, you all remember. He first time officially questioned the государственность, statehood of Ukraine. He questioned the fact that Ukraine is a state and is a nation. But I was honestly deeply shocked not only by the substance of his speech, but about this coldness and about the style he delivered his speech. And it was around the time when John McCain famously said, asked what he is seeing in Putin's eyes. John McCain answered, I see 3 letters, KGB. And that's exactly what we can repeat today. Those 3 letters, KGB, we see still in his eyes. But when we are talking about the original sin you asked about, I would honestly not go back to the NATO summit in Bucharest. I will go back to Yalta. It was the original sin after the Second World War, in which my grandfather, I'm sorry to say so bluntly, my grandfather, who served in the British Army, was sold to Stalin. He was actually expelled from Scotland. He returned to Poland and immediately on the Polish border was arrested by the communist secret police for serving in the British Army. Until today, I'm keeping his soldier's book in which he has unpaid 3 months by His Majesty the King for fighting for UK and United States during the Second World War. And we've been sold, we, Poles, Lithuanians, Ukrainians, we've been sold in Yalta. And that's the original sin. That's the original sin. And I think that I love the description of an idiot made by Einstein. Einstein said, when you are doing the same and expecting the different results, you are an idiot. And I'm sorry to say, now I can tell it, we are idiots as Western world, because we are repeating the same mistakes towards Russia and expecting different results. It will not happen. If you are giving them the hand, they will eat you. They will eat you. It's their nature. Point. If you want to change the situation, we want to change Russia from inside. And this is, I think, the very important lessons we should draw from the history. First of all, we have to defeat them on the front. But secondly, we have to actively fight inside Russia. They are accusing us all the time of having the ideological centers which are directed against the Russian values, that we are plotting to destroy the great Russian society, which is obviously not true. But what we are not doing exactly what Putin is doing against our societies. We saw it. I saw it in my country. I saw it in neighboring Germany during the last European elections. Huge Russian influence over political process in United States and in Europe. Why we are not reacting? They are trying to destroy us from inside using our democratic institutions. And I call to the Western leaders not only to talk but also to act. But first, we should start with something we never did during this war. We should present a political plan after the war. The people on front and the people in the whole Western Hemisphere who are supporting Ukraine, they all should know what will be, how the world will look like after the winning in this war. How Ukraine's border will be. We should guarantee that it will be a constitutional border of Ukraine. We should also, I think, put and condition, it's not only the returning of the Russian army into the Russian territory, but also a free election in Russia and in Belarus. Why we shouldn't put this as our one of our goals in this war? Free election for Russians and free election for Belarusians. It will show that we are not Russophobes, because we are fighting also for giving the freedom to the Russian people. And I'm expecting from the Western leaders today to give a real perspective for Ukrainian people, for the whole Western world. Why we are fighting today? Because when we are just fighting for stopping Russia, it is not enough. It is not enough, because stopping Russia today is just prolonging the next war, which will happen in 10 or 20 years. I think that we should defeat Russia today and create a new world, obviously under the leadership of Western Europe and the United States of America, because it's obvious it should look like that. But first, we should win this war. But without political plan behind this war, it will be just a simple military action. We should defeat Putin militarily and ideologically, which is as much important as a military defeat of Putin. Thank you.
Katie, so I think it's fair to say that the consensus view in our hometown on the Potomac is that the upcoming summit is meant to be a quiet celebration of the alliance's 75th anniversary and no tangible steps towards Ukraine's, Moldova's, much less Georgia's membership will be taken. Yet it strikes me as very hard to imagine a secure, prosperous, safe Ukraine without something like NATO membership, without some form of tangible tripwire. Is it failure of imagination on my part, or is there some alternative path forward that you see that would be constructive?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me, Alexei, the organizers. Thank you so much for having me here. It's such a pleasure to be back in Odesa, and it's so nice to be here with you all. I am completely humbled to be on this panel, so I will defer to them on their inputs on what I'm about to say as well. But it is really interesting. The NATO summit, I believe, in July presents a wonderful opportunity for the alliance to really project strength in light of the 75th anniversary, in light of where we are in the complicated situation here in Europe and European security and stability over the long term. Unfortunately, I don't know if it's going to be taken that way. And I think you are right. I think that there is going to be a focus on the simple celebration of making it 75 years, which is a celebratory thing. This is an amazing milestone. But the summit needs to look out the next 75 years about what European and Western security looks like and how the alliance will drive that forward. I'm hopeful. I think I heard on a previous panel small specks of hope that the summit will really be substantive in a lot of ways we need it to be. But I'm not super optimistic at this point. To your point about Ukrainian NATO membership, I think we all understand that that invitation is not going to happen at this summit. And I do believe that the way that we present the alliance's views and support of Ukraine is extraordinarily important. I did just see from the Defense Ministerial yesterday out of Brussels that the ministers agreed for a NATO mission for Ukraine to up its support. And so I'm very interested on what that construct is going to look like. But there is no security guarantee like a NATO security guarantee. In fact, I would say there's no guarantee. It's commitments and assurances. And to earlier points, before, for people who are on the fence about Ukrainian membership into NATO, and look to my fellow panelists to weigh in here as well, it is true. Article 5 is not a steadfast, troops will start showing up, but it has been tremendously effective in providing stability to Europe for 75 years, and that is an indisputable fact. So there is no guarantee without NATO membership, I would argue. How does Ukraine get there? And we spoke a little bit about this before. I think there are a couple of ways. One, leadership could be bold. There could be some legacy building here with leadership, European leaders and the U.S. leaders in the current administration, that they want to take a bold political step to provide Ukraine membership because it is so important for the future of European security. And, poke those people in the collarbone and make them understand how critical it is for the long-term effectiveness and security of the alliance. I was doing a little research earlier this year when we celebrated the 20th and 25th anniversaries of NATO membership for many of our Eastern European friends. And those were pretty hard-fought fights in the United States, too, for support. That wasn't, complete consensus around the board that these Eastern allies should be into the alliance. This is not an easy conversation. This is a difficult conversation that takes true leadership. The second point, another path for Ukraine to get in, and it was a conversation I was having right before this panel, is for Ukraine to win, for Ukraine to defeat Russia. And it can only do that with the support of its allies and partners, what that looks like. And that will take a plan. That will take a plan for all parties involved. But to your point, it will lay forward a strategy, which is what we desperately need. As long as it takes was a great tagline for the first few months of the war. It is not a strategy and it is not a foreign policy. And what that foreign policy is, what that policy is for Ukraine to obtain success is critically important as we identify how this is all going to work together. So I think there are avenues, none of them are easy, but I am hopeful that leaders of these countries will understand how critically important they are. Thank you.
Thank you. Ambassador Volker, do you share some of the cautious optimism expressed by Katie about the upcoming summit? And more broadly, how can we make Ukraine's future NATO membership a successful political sell in the future? It looks like the Biden administration isn't terribly interested. I think it sort of strains credulity to imagine a future President Trump being keen on bringing Ukraine into NATO. But I mean, politics is always unpredictable. Leadership can change things. How can we, contribute towards that change?
Well, first off, I did not hear cautious optimism. I heard. I
emphasis
heard
was cautious.
I heard polite disappointment, and I would share that polite disappointment. I think it is a missed opportunity, as Catherine said. And I think what you're looking for is, okay, with this missed opportunity, is there a silver lining? And I would say that there are some pieces of silver lining here. One of them is, had we been in a situation where the Biden administration was robustly stepping forward to provide real security guarantees, bring Ukraine into NATO, give Ukraine everything they wanted and needed to win the war, there might have been a risk that former President Trump would come out against that, just to be the contrarian to what Biden was doing. And since Biden's not doing that, there is no risk at this point that Trump is going to come out against it. It's just water under the bridge, which means there is still something to play for in what the Trump administration approach would be if Trump is elected. At this stage, I think the only thing we can say about President Trump's policy on Ukraine and NATO is we don't know. And I don't think he knows. I don't think he's going to say anything about it until after he takes office, if he takes office. So there is still an argument to be made. And the argument that would be made on the Trump side of the equation would be, we are where we are today, that is 2.5 years into a war with no end in sight, with billions and billions and billions of US dollars spent and no victory, with tens and tens of thousands of Ukrainians dead. We're in that situation because of the weakness of the Biden administration. That's the argument that the Trump world would make. And so the counterpoint would be to do the opposite. It would be fire up oil and gas production, close the loopholes in the sanctions, give the Ukrainians the arms they need and take off the restrictions, and tell Putin you have to end the war now or it's going to get worse for you. That would be a way that a Trump administration could handle that. And I think after the Washington summit, that's what we kind of have to play for.
I wonder if there is a sort of distinctly Polish perspective on this that you could bring in. So, President Duda has been famously the successful Trump whisperer, being a sort of, good constructive influence on the former president. Poland the consensus running across all political parties has invested heavily into its relationship with the United States. I think it might even have a little bit of leverage in this relationship, given just the amount of military purchases and economic ties between the two countries. What's the sort of mindset with which the current Polish government is going to the NATO summit next month?
Obviously, the Polish perspective now is it's very interesting because we have a real cohabitation between, let's say, very conservative president and a center-left and center-right, so center government, and but the deep division in Polish politics, which is based on ideology, personalities, history, is really something which is comparable somehow to the division in the United States between Republicans and Democrats. However, I'm representing this part of the current government coalition. You can call, taking the American situation, a moderate Republicans. So we Polish, this part of Polish conservatives who are supporting Donald Tusk, and we are in the government. We are those who are not actually we were not in favor of a big part of the policy of the previous government in terms of, let's say, very right-wing style of this government. But despite the fact that we have a coalition government right now, and despite the fact that we have a cohabitation between the president and the government, there are a few issues which are really uniting Polish people and Polish political class. I would say that the first of those issues is the alliance with the United States. Because even those Poles who are Eurosceptical, they will never question the alliance with the United States of America. So in this regard, there is no place in Polish politics for pro-Russian forces. So the Russian influence in Polish politics is seen rather from the other side, let's say. They are using, as they are doing it in the United States, in Europe, in Western Europe, I mean, they are using both extreme right and extreme left. But when we are talking about the expectations in Poland and in Ukraine from the possible future administration of Donald Trump, Mr. Ambassador, if this scenario would be as you described, I will be the first to erect a statue of Donald Trump in Warsaw. Believe me, because I'm very proud when I'm in DC and I'm passing by the White House. I'm very proud of the monument of Tadeusz Kościuszko, standing, our hero, and also the hero of my party. So we can erect the statue of Donald Trump if he will take his opposition against Joe Biden in that way, as you described. I would be more than happy. So I can tell you that in my generation, Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, they were heroes. I had the privilege of being the first Polish member of European Parliament back in 2004 who took a floor. After the enlargement of European Union, I was one of the youngest, but I had this opportunity to take the floor in Strasbourg to address the chamber after the enlargement. And I said, I'm here in this chamber because Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher, and John Paul II. And we need now the courage and spiritual leadership we had in the 80s. When I was 14, 15 years old, under the night of the communist occupation in Poland, I was hearing BBC Foreign Service. I was hearing Voice of America. And I was hearing the voice of Margaret Thatcher when she said, over my dead body, she said it to the striking workers, but we received this strike as a strike directed against the Western values. We received this strike as a strike directed against NATO, because the communist propaganda was very in favor of this strike. in Britain. So when she said, over my dead body, we've been very, very happy. We said, yes, this is the language you should use when you are talking to the communists. And now I'm free. I was free already in 1989 because the leadership of the West, because of Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, they had courage to name the empire of evil an empire of evil. And they have courage to say no to socialism. As Margaret Thatcher said during the famous election of 1988, say no to socialism. We all said no to socialism in 1989. But unfortunately, the idea of a Russian empire was not killed in 1991. Because of the mistakes of the West, unfortunately, we are facing this war. But I hope that whoever will win the American elections this autumn, the United States of America will still be a leader of the free world, because without that, without the American leadership, we will not survive.
Katie, so we talked a lot about Ukraine, and for very good reason. I mean, it's a big and important country. It's in the middle of a war, but there is the other country that was not invited to get a membership action plan and join the alliance. That's Georgia. And whereas in Georgia in 2008, I think there was a distinct sense of geopolitical clarity about the country's future. I think there is much less clarity about its future these days, and some of it I would probably blame on the failure of Western leadership and failure of our strategic initiative in steering events in Georgia in a good direction. So what's your reading in Georgia of the current situation in Georgia and opportunities for us to get the country back on the path in which it becomes an integral part of the community of Western democracies?
Thank you for that question, and it's hard to follow because that was so inspiring. So thank you so much. I actually spoke about Georgia a couple of weeks ago, and watching what is going on in terms of the backsliding of democratic institutions and practices is really upsetting to see. Georgia has come so far in so many ways in the decades past. I think to your point, I'm going to agree with you. I think the West is to blame. And I've said this before and welcome other opinions on this. I think we missed a very opportune moment at the withdrawal of Afghanistan in 2021. Georgia was so committed to our mission there, committed to leave only when the U.S. left, had a readiness, a training facility in Georgia just for this purpose, really increased the mill-to-mill cooperation based on this relationship. And when we withdrew from Afghanistan in 2021, Georgia and other partners who contributed to that effort were no longer having a seat at the table. Up until that point, they were invited to every ministerial at NATO. They were invited to coalition talks. They had a seat at the table with leaders talking about the future and talking about the future of how we wanted global security to look. When that withdrawal happened, we didn't have a plan to keep engaging some of these partners. And I'm not saying it's a one-for-one engagement, but I think there is a very clear link of disengagement to a certain extent by some in the West with Georgia and what we're seeing now. Everyone I've spoken to, no one has a tremendous amount of optimism for the current Georgian situation and the future in Georgia. I'd like to hope, which is not a foreign policy, but I'd like to maintain hope that many Georgians do want a free and at peace Georgia. They would like to join the EU. They would like to join NATO. And I would argue this is now the time to double our engagement with Georgians who are ready to make those challenges and ready to push that country in a more democratic place.
Kurt, please.
Can I add a couple points to the Georgia conversation here? The obvious point, which it was kind of where your question was going, that I think we just have to say is we have to help Ukraine defeat Putin. If that happens, Georgia has a chance. that Georgia is a fraction of the size of Ukraine. It doesn't have the armed forces to stand up to another Russian invasion. The billionaire behind the scenes is terrified for his life. Georgia needs to see Putin defeated to be able to get beyond where it is now. That's the obvious thing, and we have to do everything possible to make that happen. The second thing is the majority of the Georgian people, by a lot, do not want the Georgian dream to be in power, and they do not want the UNM to come back to power. And all of those political parties that chop up this 80% of the vote into tiny, tiny pieces so that nobody makes it into the parliament have to stop. They have to work together. They have to put together a single list. They have to give the Georgian people a chance to vote for an alternative that will work. Because chopping up the vote this way, former Georgian Dream people over here, former UNM people over here in 17 different parties will never work.
Thank you. Let's bring the audience in. So there's the gentleman in the grey suit and polka-dotted tie. Please wait for the mic. It's on its way.
Thank you very much. Archie Hamilton, United Kingdom. I've been on the NATO Parliamentary Assembly for the last 18 years, and I don't think that most of our allies in the West actually want Ukraine to win. I think they want to control and contain Russia, but I don't think they want it to win. You win wars with determination of your troops and technology. When it comes to technology, we have always been behind the curve. We took time to authorize Leopard tanks, we took time to authorize missile systems and so forth, and all the time we've been very loath to actually give Ukraine the technology it needs to win this war. And unless we do, the situation can only turn out badly. We have to win this war, and people in Washington are saying, well, what will happen to Russia if Putin goes? It'll break up into a lot of little fiefdoms. Well, I'm prepared to risk that because I don't think it'll ever happen. And at the end of the day, if we don't win this war, NATO will live to regret it in the long term.
Thank you. Let's go. The gentleman in glasses, white shirt. Can you get them?
Thank you to our organizers for yet another excellent panel. My name is Rick Fawn from the University of St Andrews in Scotland, which was the home of the Polish military in the Second World War. So we are very grateful. We recognize that, and we know the tragic fate of some of those personnel. Yalta, yes, a grand sellout, but at the same time, a remarkable development, and that was that Germany, Italy, Japan were occupied. And it was a very successful occupation that created democracies and market economies to the point that decades later we have the irony that we want them to remilitarize and to send lethal military assistance to this country. So there are pairs of stories. In the early 1990s, Russia was left to itself. We had aspirations that it might change. We didn't complete the story. I agree very, very much that if we want peace, if we want security, there has to be fundamental regime change also in Russia. The question, how do we get, again, there were in the 1990s, how do we get to the point where there are free elections in Belarus and Russia, the situation where we can really have a genuine, lasting peace? All strength to Ukraine, but that's only part of the question. Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody wishes to answer that one? No. So let's go to the honorable lady from Bucharest.
Yes, hello, Ivana Klempush-Tsintsadze, Ukrainian MP. I share the view that, unfortunately, that is not going to be a projection of strength, non-invitation to Ukraine at already Washington summit. It sends totally different signal to Russian Federation, and I think basically Putin yesterday, when he was, outlining his surrealistic dreams, he yet again suggested that he's going to play on that. So we are all this time in this seeing ourselves or seeing the West with all the greatest appreciation what has been done, what has been delivered, what kind of support we received, but in some kind of escalation management business. That does not lead us anywhere. Because as you were saying, Kathy, as long as it takes what? The last Ukrainian to die or what? As long as it takes for Russia to be defeated, that would be totally different message, or for Ukraine to win. And my question is, how come, or what could we do in order for the Western leaders to actually learn on the mistakes, on the misreadings, on the misactions that they have already done, with what has led to Georgian aggression against Georgia, with what has led to annexation of Crimea, with later on, all the pitiful reaction has led to this full-scale invasion. How to ensure that we are capable of learning on our mistakes? What should be done?
Thank you. Again, anybody wishes to answer that one?
I just have one reaction to that, which is we need to elect younger leaders. Because, right, people at the age that we've got now have no mentors who they listen to. They only listen to themselves. They're very stubborn. And younger people actually have role models and mentors out there that they still pay attention to.
If I can completely agree. I think the senator mentioned this earlier. We really struggle with learning the lessons from history, and we really struggle to apply them to current day affairs and issues. And I think understanding Russia and Russia's objectives and the Kremlin's objectives, and how they use history as a weapon to justify their actions. Many in the West struggle with understanding what those implications are, and it has felt in the past few years all that is old is new again, in terms of us seeking hopeful foreign policy with Russia while not acknowledging who they really are as an actor on the world stage.
I have one idea, actually, to have a special Deputy Secretary General of NATO who will be in charge of ideological war. I think that we should have some institutionalized institution, I'm sorry to say, which will counteract on every field the Russian propaganda, which is directed against the goals of NATO, against the security of NATO, and which will also project the future and the political development of our enemies, including Russia, obviously. Why we are, I'm repeating, why we are not active politically in Russia. We should be active as West. Otherwise, they will do it as they want. One of the gentlemen mentioned of the very successful occupations after the Second World War, but they led to free elections. The Germany was occupied, and the occupied forces helped to organize free elections. So I'm not calling now to occupation of Russia. I want to be properly understand, but the kind of guarantees, if we will win the war, we will dictate the conditions of the peace. So what I'm calling on, I think it's quite realistic. I'm calling, if we will win the war, please, I'm calling to Western leaders, make it as one condition of the peace, the free elections under our supervision in Belarus and in Russia. The return to return to the Russian constitution from 90s. Just the returning to the Russian constitutions. just withdrawing all the amendments made by Putin. I think it's quite realistic, and it will be an attempt to revive a democracy in Russia. And to be very honest, why we Poles and Ukrainians, why we need to talk like this today to our friends? Because otherwise they will not help us to fight against Russia. If we will not present Poles and Ukrainians that we have an idea about Russia after the war, they will never believe us. They will always say, oh, okay, you are crazy Russophobes. You just want to have a constant war with Russia. We should present, we, Poles and Ukrainians, Lithuanians, we should present to the West a vision of our cooperation with Russia, just to make West be sure that our strength is a guarantee for peace, not an invitation for another wars. And I think that this is the goal of the political class of Ukraine, Poland and Lithuania, to present an idea of the western part, of the eastern part of NATO as a stable part of the geopolitical system in Europe. Because you can, using historical arguments, you can say when our Commonwealth collapsed, Russia entered the European politics. And when Russia entered the European politics, all the bad things which happened in the last 200 years in Europe happened because of that. Because Russia entered the center of Europe, went to the heart of Europe, occupying Poland and destroying our common state of Poland, Lithuania and Ukraine in the 18th century.
By nature, I'm very eager to please people, almost like a Labrador retriever. So it really is weighing on me that I'm going to disappoint almost everybody in this room with their hands up. But before we wrap up, I want to give the floor for just 30 seconds to our Georgian friend in the second row, because we've been talking about Georgia a lot, but I will have to ask him to keep his remarks very, very brief. And then we'll wrap up.
Yeah, thank you very much. I appreciate it. I happen to be also Georgi Baramidze, ex-defense minister of Georgia, and happens to be political secretary of the UNM ambassador mentioned. And I agree with you. Certainly, we don't have a 50% plus support in our country, as well as current government. But there are so many differences between our parties. We are pro-Western, and current government is now, for everybody clear, pro-Russian. And what I like to say, in Ukraine, Putin must be defeated, and certainly must be defeated using tanks, artillery, HIMARS, and so on and forth. But in Georgia, if we don't want to lose Georgia, Putin also must be defeated without tanks and artillery. But rest must be used every possible means in order to defeat Putin in Georgia. Otherwise, God forbid, after the 26th of October this year, Georgia might be very similar to Belarus. And it will be very big problem for Ukraine as well, for a concerted effort of the West as well, because Georgia is a Black Sea country. And if it completely turns its back to the Ukraine and to the West, it will be problem for the security of the Black Sea and for the victory of Ukraine as well. So therefore, I would certainly wish to see the policies what Mike described and what has been said, that doubling up to the efforts to Georgia to help Georgian society win this peaceful battle to defeat Putin in Georgia. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I think that's a very important note on which I'm afraid we have to wrap up this session. So please join me in thanking Ambassador Volker, Senator Michał Kamiński, and Catherine Sendak from CEPA. Thank you, and please enjoy your lunch.